No, I was not on microphone. So now that I am on microphone, now I can hear myself. All right, let's start over. This is Jonathan Albin, the Game Master Guru, and we are covering the 10. These are my 10-piece snippets each week that outline things that will help or at least prevent the hindrance of your game session as a storyteller. As I was saying, which I now get to say again, the rules of engagement that a game master creates for himself have more to do with holding to his preconceived views of how the game session should go than on how he's going to interact with the players. Arguably, however, the player characters will measure the game not on the basis of how well the adventure was written in advance or how well it was executed. Instead, they're going to be reveling with or complaining about the game master's ability to handle the difficulties in session and how smoothly the game goes overall. So when I speak of the ploys here that a game master entertains, what I'm referring to in particular are those rules that we sort of set in place as hopeful objectives, and they tend to never hold true. Let's dive right into them, shall we? The first one is the first ploy. The first thing that a game master tries to expect is that the player composition, the party members themselves, will become collectively balanced. Now that sounds wonderful, that everyone's going to be equally portrayed in the session, that all will get about the same amount of time to engage, each one will do their part to move towards success, and each of them will take their own punishments, if you will, when things don't go right. The first thing to realize is while this may be a game master objective, players do not want balance. As a matter of fact, they want the odds stacked in their favor. They want advantage each and every time they can get it. They want to test the envelope in the places where you've told them they can't go. So realizing this, it means that you have to adapt the session and your group week over week. You have to bring them into balance through external means, which means you have to break this very ploy. You cannot expect your players to be balanced because it simply does not happen. Now the next thing that we try to hold to is that our story is going to be insulated. In other words, I build a location, I build some encounters, I build a plot, I've put in a couple of compelling NPCs, I've got all my hooks in a row, so now naturally the players should stay in the adventure as written, right? No. As a matter of fact, if there is a map that you've drawn, if it has edges, if there is an end to your map, the players will inevitably strike out to try to cross that barrier. It doesn't matter how hard you try. It's just a mechanic of the human existence. When we are put into a set amount of space, we want to find where those limits are and find ways to cross them. Furthermore, this adds to something else. The GM thinks that the players are there to enjoy his story. No, the players are there to watch him squirm. We as game masters, we as storytellers often try to create a place and an environment where our players, where our players will feel comfortable. They'll be able to stay within the storylines and we can engage and have a great time. But reality is they want to see what's behind the facade. They want to hear the story that you intended, not necessarily the one that you chose to share. Of course, this will play into a couple of the other ploys that I'll be coming up to in a minute, but the reality is that the players seek the story that you need to share, not the one that you intended. We often put together all the pieces of a great story and somehow subconsciously leave out 1 or 2 or 10 pieces that would fulfill someone else's objective, someone else's desires for the game. And by doing so, we create a hole that they then use to dig out. They find a way to move the story past the boundaries and barriers, asking questions about NPCs you didn't suggest, and so on. Of course, this leads to another key point in Game Master Ploys, and that is that somehow the NPCs will be inviolable. If there's an NPC in town that's a rich man, guarantee the rogue is going to want to try to rob him. If there's a very beautiful and compelling companion in the village, the bard is going to try to seduce her. It's just part of the mechanic. Players don't know what the limits of decency are in game, nor do they have a real understanding of moral values within the game unless you teach them. They come into the story with their predetermined notes in their own head about what their characters will do or what their characters are capable of, and you have to push them up or pull them down, so to speak, when they get a little outside of that framework. But you have to do so in a way that does not suspend the disbelief that the players have to engage. Instead, you have to realize that your NPCs will be, I use the word inviolable, so yeah, violated. There will be times when they'll ask for the hit points on the school teacher. I mean, it's crazy, but that's the reality of it. And it's in part because of player mentality, but it's also the situations can escalate due to the vocabulary you use, the word description, maybe some ambiguity, or even flat-out misunderstanding between yourself and the players. Inevitably, it'll come to a situation where somebody says, okay, well, I'm drawing a weapon, and you have to say, okay, roll for initiative. When the NPCs become targets, you have to realize that means you have to be adaptable, because your trope, your belief that somehow NPCs are inviolable has now come to a distinct end. Ploy number 4. Villain plans and monstrous traps, they can be subtle. We all want to believe that. We think we can be particularly clever as a game master. But there's something about the direction that a game master provides that leads the players to places that they don't necessarily want to be and that you can't get them out of because they missed your subtle cues. They didn't notice the danger of the lethal nature of the trap or whatever. Realize that the key point here is that a plan undiscovered is no plan at all. If you've built a story around a certain death that's going to set itself upon players that get into a position, and you only give subtle clues, veiled hints, speculative rumor, you just consigned the player character or more to whatever fate is set before them. Even if you set it to a die roll, odds are statistically that out of any group of 5 players to 8 players, one of them is going to blow the roll. Now realize that if you go on the other end of the spectrum and you talk about, well, I've got a really clever villain, I'm going to be playing a Moriarty, I'm going to be planning to engage the player characters at their own level. If the villain is too clever, quite simply the party will not engage with them. If you have a bad guy who is clearly a bad guy, the players will find a way to avoid him and not engage him or even placate him in the name of moving forward what they perceive to be the story. Just realize that if there are it is in these mistakes, in these challenges, that memories are made. So you want to make mistakes. You don't want to make it so that your plan is so subtle that it cannot be discovered. There's one of my earlier videos. You want to get a chance, look for it. It's how to create the effective villain, because there's an entire section on what you must do to make mistakes and how to accomplish it so that the players feel satisfied and you still get away with not being your optimal best as a story creator. Let's go on to the next one. Point number 5. The adventure group will enjoy victories and celebrate. I'm in my past been a speech writer, and one of the biggest challenges to writing speeches is to time into the speech both the applause lines and the laugh lines. And players are arguably the worst audience in the world because they're not there to appreciate what you've done. They're there to engage with and perhaps defeat what you have done. So realizing that they will not take the time to celebrate at the end of a section, realize that you can set one up and Players, unfortunately, when they see an orchestrated, planned celebration, they automatically know that that's an harbinger, an embarkation point on another story. So they're not going to engage with it, and you can't expect them to. It's an incorrect ploy because it depends on the players to be both audience and participants, and it doesn't work that way. Realize that the breaks in action aren't really causes for celebration anyway. When you build a story and you let the Wookiee win, so to speak, when the bad guys have been defeated, that only gives an opportunity for those villains, if possible, to gain retribution, or for other villains to see openings to begin their own assault. So holding that into mind, just realize that your great big party after the witch is dead is going to last about as long as the song, and then you'll be moving on to the next part of the story from a player's standpoint. Ploy number 6, and this one I get into all the time. I try, and I should know better, but villains can be multidimensional is the ploy. I think, as a storyteller, I can explain that the villain had a bad childhood, or the villain didn't get enough milk, or something. But when you try to create that multidimensionality, it runs into the gamer's mind. And the gamer's mind, the player's mind, is really about problem solving. And when you add extra dimensions, all you're doing is adding multiple variables, and very few like to, and even arguably fewer, actually can solve for multiple variables on the fly. So realizing that, you have to take into account the fact that players are only going to see your villain as one thing. I have a devious and arguably hideous little beast known as Atherton. And not that Alistair's not a villain, but that's another story altogether. Atherton thing, and when they met him, he was arguably the most horrible he could be. He was involved actually in a carnal, I guess you'd call it felonious, very, very bad act. But what the players remember him for is causing one of their members to dance. He's known as Atherton the Dancer. So, realizing therefore that the nature of a player is not to see the villains as multidimensional, we as game masters, try as we might, have a real difficult time with making multidimensional villains, even though the players will claim they want it. Yeah, forget about it. They want to have a villain they can define and paint with broad strokes. Realize that in most encounters, the story itself becomes an empirical exercise. We see it, we engage with it, we win or lose against it, and we move on. That is the crux of most adventure games encounters. Now, there are a couple of stipulations where you can add in nuances, and I'm not going to go into them too much because actually they end up being detrimental to the cause altogether. But betrayal and revenge are two core causes that are transparent multi-dimensions. In other words, I'm after you now because you beat me and because I'm a dancer or whatever. But that most any other emotional dimension that you try to put into a character will get lumped in to the core definition that the players have accepted and built for themselves. Number 7. There can be more than one major thread going on in a story, and don't I know it? This is our biggest failure as a game master, because there is so much going on Nikos. There's so many things a player could do that it's awful hard for me as a GM to hold to just one. But generally, the players choose what they're going to follow and decide from that position the relevancy of clues. So if you feed them a line of really good information on plot number 2, but they've only chosen plot number 1, all that effort will go to the side because they will simply disregard it or count it as superfluous. Also, on a more simplistic case, Setting up too many possibilities for a player group is simply asking them to go into player vapor lock. When you have a lot of different things you could do without perfect information, you tend to sit and vacillate on which of them you're going to follow. Really, successful storytelling comes from knitting together the broken ends of the unpursued pieces, session after session, to link them together so that the players feel that they are accomplishing down a singular course, but you can incorporate that data into your own mental gymnastics if you so desire. But more importantly, the players don't see it because they will ultimately only follow one major thread at a time. That doesn't mean they won't put it on the docket, but it means that they're not going to be actively pursuing multiple clues at multiple times, because it's just not how we that players work. We work. Next one, number 8. Ploy number 8, and this one is another one that gets me into trouble, so it's tattletale time. I have the unreasoning belief that all players can be drivers. Okay, guilty as charged. Now, some can act to drive the story under pressure, but others can't. So, putting players in a situation where they must be a driver for an encounter, an individual encounter you might get away with, but for a campaign, you are just asking for trouble, because some players actually prefer the passenger seat. They like to see what's going on, they like to hear the story, but they don't really want to be the one to have to make the villain talk. As a matter of fact, though, and this is arguably where we get into the most trouble, is that some players seem to fundamentally get car sick if they are not behind the wheel. In other words, they as a player are so used to being in the limelight, so used to being the front runner in a tale, that when you put them in a situation where they are in the back seat or not the direct focus of attention, they tend to lose it. Realizing this, therefore, we have to realize that players have limitations, and that we can certainly explore what those limitations are, push the players as far as they can go, but realize that ultimately some players simply can't be or won't be able to be a driver. Number 9. Every story is equally memorable, and yet again, guilty as charged. Nikos has so many stories and so many really cool things to follow that I'd love to be able to get everybody to engage with every one of them excitedly, and it's just not the case. Some days you hit the nerves just right, and sometimes you fall flat on your face. Now, a good game master, even a competent game master, is going to loop in the bad parts and cause them to be a piece of the background scenery, and that leads to what I call on-the-fly game mastering, or bubble tech. But gaming on the fly can only get you so far. In other words, and I've been guilty of this recently, sitting down at the table saying, okay guys, what are we doing? And then letting the players choose a course sometimes doesn't leave them with as many good options as they would have had otherwise. Now, players, though, are the ones who are the rememberers. I can remember, specific times when players made dumb decisions, but that's not what's remembered. I can remember situations where lethality was at a high and the players should have been terrified, but they're not the ones. The players are the ones that remember. So realizing that it's the players, not you, that decide what is remembered and what is not. Just remember to keep on swimming. Keep pushing forward on your story, because maybe this is a dog. Maybe this story didn't go as well. Make it as exciting as you can. Make it as developed as you can, because maybe you won't remember it, but later on they'll go, oh, hey, remember last Tuesday? The game that was so bad. Yeah, I remember da-da-da happened, and that was really awesome. And don't argue with them. They're the ones that are doing the remembering. So move forward from there. Finally, and this one's the big one, every game master on the planet holds this trope to be true, this ploy to be true. We believe, that one day the story will end. No, Because the reality is, characters never die unless it serves the story. If you, as a game master, want to keep a story moving, you can retcon, you can rescue, you can redeem literally anybody you want. So don't think the story must have an end, or even that it does, because the next thing to realize is that death, as Imhotep would say, is only the beginning. Even if you assume that the characters have died and the players are ready to move on, the next characters you may run into may actually be the grandchildren of the characters they played last time. There's going to be segments and pieces of the history of your world that are going to move on from generation to generation. How do you think I made it 8 iterations into Nikos without there being some level of rebirth, regeneration of the story from time to time? Just realize that if you build a story, a compelling story, even with one that has all of these tropes, you're trying to do all these things, the players will come if you build it. It's that if you build it, they will come thing from Field of Dreams. If you have a compelling story and you tell it consistently, the players will return to the table. As the way I say it, if you build it, they will come back. Alrighty, those are the 10 ploys that never work for game masters, and this is Jonathan Albin, the Game Mastery Guru. You guys have a great day.